what is it? What is it about humanity that wants to go to all the details and stuff and listen? You know, these guys like Fauci get up there and start talking. You know, he doesn't know anything really about anything, and I'd say that to his face. Nothing. The man thinks you can take a blood sample and stick it in an electron microscope, and if it's got a virus in there, you'll know it. Those guys have got an agenda, which is not what we would like them to have, being that we pay for them to take care of our health in some way.
Let's talk to Mike Yeadon. He's former chief scientific advisor with Pfizer, the big pharmaceutical companies. We've spoken to him, as you'll know, many times before about things like the false positive rate and the problems with mass testing. Now, this, of course, comes at a time when we're about to see the mass testing with a rapid test over pretty much the entire population of Liverpool. That is the latest plan. But is that the answer to the problem? Mike Yeadon, good morning to you.
Good morning,
Good
Julia.
morning. We've been, virtually everyone I've spoken to, whatever we're talking about, anything to do with lockdown, anything to do with the problems with the hospitals and the like, we're constantly come back to, it's the problem with testing and test and track and trace, and that we're not testing enough people, we're not testing enough of the right people, and we're not getting those test results back. Is that the problem?
No. Good morning, everybody. It's really, it sounds counterintuitive, but in my opinion, you don't chase respiratory viruses around the country using industrial molecular biology. I don't think we should be testing anybody unless they turn up to a hospital. And even then, we should be doing it better than we're doing. The test is not to be trusted. Everything they're telling you about, cases, admissions, people in ICU, and deaths, all pivot off this PCR test. People saying the R number. The R number depends on the PCR test, which I'm telling you is unreliable. More COVID patients going into hospital depends on the PCR test, which I'm saying is unreliable. Even the people operating it could not stand in front of you and say what percentage of the positives are genuine.
When we see these stark figures and they're reported in very sort of ponderous tones on the television, you know, we've had 500 more deaths or 400, whatever it is on any given day.
Taking the total number across the UK to 41,759.
Often, actually, if you dig into it, you look at actually over the days in which they've actually been, the date of death as opposed to reported death, actually we're looking at far lower numbers. But also these are deaths with COVID, not of COVID. So you can be in hospital for a whole variety of other reasons. You can have heart disease, you can have cancer. If you test positive for COVID, you still end up on these statistics, don't you?
And see, this is what I'm saying. Everything you're being told, every scary fact and prediction from Whitty and Valence, all hangs off the PCR test, which they have admitted they cannot tell what percentage of positives are false and true.
When you do a PCR test, you basically amplify the amount of RNA, you put it into a DNA copy, and then you exponentially double that amount of DNA. And that's called the cycle threshold. And the more times you do that, the less virus you start out with. And this is important because you can basically pick up a single copy of RNA in an individual.
All right. There have been a number of reports of patients who shed viral RNA for weeks, as determined by PCR. It doesn't seem to be infectious virus. And the real question is, are they a threat for transmission? And I'm wondering if you think we could use a cutoff of viral loads determined by PCR to say this patient is no longer infectious, can go home, can go to a nursing facility. Because right now the physicians are really having a hard time with that.
Right. Again, a good question. And what is now sort of evolving into a bit of a standard that if you get a cycle threshold of 35 or more, that the chances of it being replication competent are minuscule. And it's very frustrating for the patients as well as for the physicians. Somebody comes in and they repeat their PCR and it's like 37 cycle threshold. But you almost never can culture virus from a 37 threshold cycle. So I think if somebody does come in with 37, 38, even 36, you got to say, it's just dead nucleotides, period.
We have found RNA shedding in evidence for 78 days. because the RNA is only 20 base pairs long, and it takes much longer for you to degrade the RNA.
We know that, because it's been shown, that people who've recovered from the virus and they're clinically well, and you can no longer culture virus from a sample from their mouth or airways, still can be positive in the PCR test. And that's because, as you say, the test is not a test for virus, it's not a test for living virus. The test looks for a particular piece of the genetic code. And if it finds a small piece of a dead virus that's still stuck in your mucus and is being shed from cells, you could still be positive on a swab test for a long time.
Until today, the most panic-inducing principle, namely that most media still speak about today we had so many new infections.
Well, the latest government figures show the highest daily number of new infections.
That's the increase in the number of daily infections.
With coronavirus infections in England doubling every 7 to 8 days.
The rate of infections are growing significantly.
Yesterday, you might remember, we reported the highest number of infections. The figures out today have shown an uptick in infection rates in London.
A steep rise in coronavirus infections in England.
322 new cases of infection.
With what is clearly a second wave of infection about to break.
Which is totally, it's not true. A virus, it's a particle. It goes to everybody. So if somebody is immune, the virus also goes into this body. And it will multiply even a little bit. But if you're immune, you attack the virus first with antibodies. And you make immediately debris. The virus is destroyed. You have only parts of the virus around. In your tissue, if you make a swab, or in your blood, if you go and test you will find this debris, and part of the debris will be nucleic acids, RNA. And if you make a PCR, all these people will be positive, because the PCR picks up 2 tiny, or if it's a good assay, 3, sometimes 2, sometimes only 1 tiny little piece of RNA that is then amplified. And this assay cannot tell you whether you had the virus or you just had some dead chunk of the virus, which still gives you a positive result. So corona positive with a PCR, it tells you only a little tiny bit of DNA, of RNA, nucleic acid was there, but it doesn't tell you whether it was the virus complete or even a virulent, meaning a virus that can really make you sick. All this is not in this test. This test only says little piece was there. And that no other virus ever on this planet has been accompanied by so much testing, and a testing that has created so much nonsense and panic.
So is the threshold cycle is reporting out a pretty standard practice in doing a diagnosis now, rather than just positive or negative? Okay, good.
Yeah, I mean, if when you go in, when I get my test, it's negative. When someone comes in and it's positive, they don't give them the threshold until you go back and ask for it.
Okay, but they've got it.
They've got it.
Right.
They've got it.
How did we get here? Why are we even using this test? So in January, a German virologist named Christian Drosten, he created a new laboratory assay to detect the coronavirus from the German Center for Infection Research, and he put out the WHO quickly picked up that guideline, and the Euro Surveillance also published that in their journal. It's a infectious disease epidemiology journal, and it's called Detection of 2019 Novel Coronavirus by Real-Time RT-PCR, and that was in January. A lot of people had an issue with that. They took to Twitter. A guy named Walter Akima went on Twitter and really questioned why the heck that thing was rushed so fast. He basically said, of all the publications, no research paper got reviewed and accepted in less than 20 days. One got accepted in less than 24 hours after submission, and that was the Drosten paper. It's come to be known as the Drosten Review. So now the breaking news on this is this paper is being contested, as is and by extension, so is this new assay PCR test that is being used, and that's PCR test that's being used really everywhere throughout the world.
This is what's driving the lockdown, right? I just saw, California, you're not allowed out of your house. You can't get in a car. You can't get on a bicycle. You can't do anything because the PCR tests are showing that there's this dramatic increase in cases.
Yeah, so the PCR is being contested by 22. These are credible health professionals. They've done an external peer review because they're basically stating the first one was not peer reviewed. They sent it to Eurosurveillance editorial board asking for a retraction. What they did was looked at all components of the test design. The protocol recommendations were assessed. They looked at the parameters and they examined those against relevant scientific literature. And now this is a deep dive, so I recommend anybody go into this, but I took some segments from it, and let's just read a couple here just to give you an idea what these tests, some of the issues with this test. So, and there's 10 of them, there's 10 major errors in there. I just took a couple out. Number 3, the test cannot discriminate between the whole virus and viral fragments. Number 6, the PCR product have not been validated at the molecular level. Number 7, the PCR test contains neither a unique positive control to evaluate its specificity for SARS-CoV-2 nor a negative control to exclude the presence of other coronaviruses. Number 8, the test design in the Corman-Drozdin paper is so vague and flawed that one can go in dozens of different directions. Nothing is standardized, and there is no standard operating procedure. And number 10, we find severe conflicts of interest for at least 4 authors, in addition to the fact that 2 of the authors of the Corman-Drozdin paper, Christian Drozdin and Chantal Ruskin, are members of the editorial board of Eurosurveillance, which may explain why it was peer-reviewed so quickly or put in that journal so quickly. Now, this is something that's very interesting, and it speaks to the cycling. And this is directly from the paper. We've talked about the cycling. They go right in. This is probably the most concise description I've ever seen. And they say about the cycling, if someone is tested by PCR as positive when a threshold of 35 cycles or higher is used, as is the case in most laboratories in Europe and the US, the probability that said person is actually infected is less than 3%.
Whoa.
The probability that said result is false positive is 97%.
My God. Oh, we're destroying the world with this test, and it's 97% inaccurate. Did you hear that, folks? This is not me. This is not somebody, a reporter out there. This is a pretty large group of scientists involved in this too, right? Authors on this rebuke of the PCR test.
Yeah, there's 22, and these are not run-of-the-mill scientists. These are researchers. These are world-renowned doctors and academics, people that have held positions in pharmaceutical companies such as Pfizer. Now, let's look at the conclusion of this paper. I know it's a long segment, but it's so important. So they say, in light of our re-examination of the test protocol to identify SARS-CoV-2 described in the Corman-Drozdin paper, we have identified concerning errors and inherent fallacies which render the SARS-CoV-2 PCR test useless. If there's a headline, that's it right there. And finally, they say a decision to recognize the errors apparent in the Corman-Drozdin paper has the benefit to greatly minimize human costs and suffering going forward. Is it not in the best interest of Eurosurveillance to retract this paper? Our conclusion is clear. In the face of all the tremendous PCR protocol design flaws and errors described here, we conclude there is not much of a choice left in the framework of scientific integrity and responsibility.
Boom. Wow, Jeffrey, that's gigantic. That's gigantic. We have, and this really is behind this entire pandemic. Without the false positives of this PCR test, none of this story adds up.
Are you saying that this new test being rolled out, this rapid test, and explain to us, if you would, why it's different from the old PCR tests everyone's been using with the swabs? Are you saying that this is showing that those tests are not giving us a full picture of what's really going on, and actually we are not seeing this massive increase in infections?
That's exactly what I'm saying. So yes, the test is different. So the test that we have been using for diagnosis looks for RNA, which is a viral equivalent of DNA. It's what it uses to replicate. And that test can fail. And it can fail when you put labs under pressure, when you're doing high volume, high speed testing, then you can end up with cross-contamination, but also all sorts of other problems. And it's well described in the medical literature that with PCR testing particularly, you can get false positive pseudo-epidemics. And I think that's what's happening here. Now, the test that the Army are using in Liverpool tests for viral particles. It's looking for the protein of the virus. And so it will only test positive if there's real virus there. It's a bit harder for a mistake to be made with this kind of a test.
How do they misuse PCR to estimate all these supposed free viral RNAs that may or may not be there?
I think misuse PCR is not quite. I don't think you can misuse PCR. Actually, no, the results, the interpretation of it. See, if you can say, if they could find this virus in you at all, and with PCR, if you do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody. It starts making you believe in the sort of Buddhist notion that everything is contained in everything else, right? I mean, because if you can amplify one single molecule up to something that you can really measure, which PCR can do, then there's just very few molecules that you don't have at least one single one of them in your body, okay? So that could be thought of as a misuse of it, just to claim that it's meaningful. There's very little of what they call HIV, and what's been brought out here by Phil Pott and Isai already, the measurement for it is not exact at all. It's not as good as our measurement for things like apples. An apple is an apple. You know, you can get something that's kind of like, if you got enough things that look kind of like an apple and you stick them all together, you might think it was an apple. But and HIV is like that. Those tests are all based on things that are invisible, and the results are inferred in a sense. PCR is separate from that. It's just a process that's used to make a whole lot of something out of something. That's what it is. But it's not. It doesn't tell you that you're sick, and it doesn't tell you that the thing you ended up with really was going to hurt you or anything like that.
So if we go on to the PCR step, and this is the cyclical duplication of DNA. What I've seen with the coronavirus testing is that they choose a cycle number. I've seen 36 and 37. I haven't seen it published very much. Yeah. And if you obtain sufficient DNA by that cycle, it's considered positive, and if you don't, it's considered negative. I mean, that seems kind of arbitrary.
It's absolute nonsense. Yes, it's absolute nonsense. It makes no sense whatsoever.
So is there a different way to do it apart from choosing an arbitrary cycle number?
It depends on a lot of different things. First, different instruments give you different cycle numbers. Different PCR master mixes can give you different cycle numbers. Different lots of probes can give you different cycle numbers. So the cycle number per se is not a good measure. The second point is that for most instruments, of all instruments really, once you get above a cycle of about 35, then you start worrying about the reliability of your result, because that would be roughly equivalent to a single copy.
You have been quite critical of the tests that are based on polymerase reaction, in effect giving us too many false positives. Is that a fair assessment of your criticism, and what do you think the response to that should be?
So look, the test is a very helpful test, but if you just use it in a blanket policy without thinking through the strategy of what you use the test with what threshold, you end up with this problem of false positive. You are identifying too many people who could have had the infection in the past. Because you can shed RNA for up to 3 months, despite having the infection for only 8 days, we are potentially following people who are red herrings. And you're not picking up and allowing the 1 or 2 people who are what you've just described before, the super spreaders that you need to isolate and get to their contacts. So what we need now is, once we accept the infection is endemic, is a process where we start to develop our strategy around the testing. And a cycle threshold above 35 generally is people who are not infectious. Now you can put in a threshold level which says you are infectious, which is a cycle threshold of about 25. And if you do that, you can pick up the people who are infectious. But the way we're deploying the test at the moment is in a sort of ragbag way that says, whatever amount of RNA you've got on board, you are positive.
A cycle threshold of 35 or more that the chances of it being replication competent are minuscule. You almost never can culture virus from a 37 threshold cycle. So I think if somebody does come in with 37, 38, even 36, you got to say, it's just dead nucleotides, period.
So if you were to go to, say, 40 cycles, you might get a positive result, but it might be a false positive.
I would be very unhappy about a 40 cycle PCR. I would be very unhappy about a 40 cycle PCR.
Yet NHS England documentation that has not been updated since January runs cycle thresholds to 45, which is identifying people who are not infectious.